Imagine a city so convinced of its own invincibility that no warrior thought to challenge it, no siege engine planned, no captain dared whisper a plan of assault. The city was Jericho, an oasis crowned by date palms, its walls double-layered and proud, the hub of caravans and commerce. The fall of the walls of Jericho began not with battering rams or secret tunnels, but with a procession that looked, to the casual onlooker, like a peculiar act of worship, priests carrying the ark, rams' horns sounding, and an entire people moving in quiet obedience. What we are about to revisit is not simply an ancient military curiosity. It is a story that teaches us how God overturns human pride, how repeated obedience prepares the way for divine action, and how mercy finds a home in the most unlikely places. If the story you're about to hear touches you, subscribe so we can walk through more biblical scenes together. Picture Jericho at its height. Imagine arriving at a fertile pocket in the Jordan Valley, where water springs to the surface, and where the air tastes faintly of river mud and crushed palm fronds. You would find houses built of sun-dried brick, flat roofs where families sleep in heat, and markets that smell of cumin, frankincense, and roasted figs. Traders would have bargained beneath woven awnings, muleteers would have counted their coins, priests of local shrines would have rearranged their idols and accepted offerings. The city lay along important trade routes. It was a place of strategic advantage, a gateway on the way into the hill country. To outsiders, Jericho was secure. Its walls, some studies suggest, were massive, perhaps layered with stone and earth, giving the impression of an unassailable fortress. Archaeologists debate exact dimensions and dates, and some studies indicate notable fortifications stood there long enough to inspire awe. Yet the real strength of Jericho was not stone alone. The people who lived within those walls believed in systems of power rooted in religion, wealth, and social order. Behind the markets and the palms, the life of the city was held together by practices, by rituals, by assumptions about safety. Underneath the prosperity lay a moral rot. The markets were also temples, where spices and cloth changed hands, bargains were often sealed with ritual. Idols claimed devotion in corners of the courtyards. Systems of debt and patronage left the poor in the shadow of the wealthy. The very institutions that made Jericho prosperous also shielded practices that dehumanized the vulnerable. Inhabitants placed their trust in visible defenses and invisible rights alike. Their confidence came to rest on the walls and on practices that seemed to guarantee advantage. Pride grows quietly. It fashions a narrative. Our walls keep us safe. Our gods favor us. We are secure by our own means. That is the kind of confidence that hardens into a wall of the soul. Into this setting came another company, Israel, led by Joshua. This was not a battalion of ornately armored conquerors. This was a people who had marched out of slavery and had been shaped by years of wandering and covenantal memory. They carried the Ark of the Covenant, the visible sign of God's presence among them, and priests followed, blowing the ram's horns. They came with a discipline unlike any conventional army. The people were told to be silent, to follow a pattern that must have felt baffling. Walk around once for 6 days, and do something different on the 7th. From day 1 to day 6, the pattern was singular and steady. Each morning the procession formed. Each time they circled the city, the people kept silence except for the sound of the horns. One day, one circuit. The next day, the same. 6 days of obedience that could be mistaken for futility. Perhaps the men and women of Jericho laughed. Perhaps they mocked. We have walls, they may have said. We have our festivals and our gods. These people are only singing strange songs. But every step the people of Israel took was a step of trust. Each circuit reinforced communal discipline. Each morning's march was an act of shared dedication that did not depend on immediate results. The cadence of their feet matched something deeper, a willingness to keep moving even when nothing appears to change. Why march? Why not fight? That is the confronting part of the story. Human strategy often looks for techniques, maneuvers, and force. God's plan, as revealed in this account, required surrender of human tactics. Obedience replaced cleverness, Patience replaced haste. The community was learning to let the presence of God dictate the timing and method of victory. The ark at the center, the priests with the trumpets, the people moving as one. This was a religious movement that became a military instrument only because God ordained it so. The lesson is not that military force is always wrong, nor that there will always be spectacular wall collapses in our lives. The point is that God can act in ways that overturn our assumptions about power when we align our obedience with divine command. On the seventh day, the rhythm changed. They rose early. The cadence intensified. The people circled the city 7 times, 7 circlets that tightened like a rope around the pride of Jericho. The priests blew the trumpets with increased volume. The people held their breath. The tension rose. This was a dramatic crescendo deliberately built into the narrative. 6 circles that shaped rhythm and discipline, and a 7th that unleashed the movement toward a transformed reality. Then came the order, and the unmistakable sound. At the blast of the priests and the shout of the people, the walls fell flat, not opened by siege engines but toppled by the hand of God. The fall of the walls of Jericho was not the product of human engineering. It was a revelation of what God can do when a community obeys together. Theologically, the event shows how God often chooses the means that expose the heart of the matter. The walls were not simply obstacle. They were the physical expression of human pride and reliance on human defenses. When God brings them down, the act is both judgment against the systems that oppress and rescue, for those willing to align themselves with divine mercy. And mercy appears in the most unexpected place, Rahab's house. Rahab was a woman on the fringes, a resident of Jericho whose life history placed her outside polite society. Yet she encountered the messengers of Israel and, in an act of faith, hid them and sent a declaration that she knew God's power. Because of that act, God's people extended a sign of preservation, a scarlet cord, and Rahab and her household were spared. The scarlet cord hung like a thread between judgment and grace, a visible token that even in a city slated for judgment, God's mercy could reach in and rescue a believer. Rahab's story resists sensationalism. It refuses to be reduced to scandal. She becomes, in the biblical testimony, an ancestor of faith, included in a lineage that points toward redemption. Her faith is not treated as incidental. It is a powerful testimony that God looks at the heart and not merely the past. This brings the ancient scene into our present. What is your Jericho? The walls in our lives are rarely made of stone. They are built out of fear that says, if I let go, I will lose everything. They are piled from pride that insists, I built this, I will be protected by it. They rise from habits that chain us secretly, addiction, bitterness, the need for control. They are composed of unhealed wounds that we wrap with defenses until the pain is muffled, but the life is stunted. These walls look mighty because they protect some comfortable arrangement, or at least the illusion of it. We plaster over shame, we decorate the facade, but the wall remains. To confront those walls requires imagination and courage. It requires asking, as Joshua's people did, what obedience looks like when it refuses conventional wisdom. It means recognizing that the discipline of repeated humble acts, the daily small obedience, matters. The march around Jericho invites us to practices that may at first seem fruitless. Small acts of generosity toward someone who hurts you, a conversation you keep postponing, a morning spent in honest prayer rather than hurried religiosity. Consistent steps away from habits that damage your soul. The story warns us against the temptation to seek a single dramatic fix. Often God's timing unfolds through repetition. 6 circuits that prepare the heart, the 7th that delivers. Our obedience is not a formula. It is a posture. Unity also matters. Jericho fell when the community acted together. Priests, Levites, and people all moved as one. The shout that brought the walls down was communal. In our lives, private faith is precious, but corporate obedience amplifies a work beyond what we can do alone. When a congregation prays persistently, when a family binds together in accountability, when a small group chooses mercy over gossip, those acts compound into power. We must not romanticize community. Churches are imperfect. Yet biblical community, when it centers on obedience to God and mutual care, becomes the instrument of transformation. Sometimes the walls that stand in our lives are so tall because we try to face them alone. We were not designed for solitary siege. Perseverance is the practical companion to obedience. The people of Israel did not stop after the first day. They did not demand spectacle. They kept walking. Many of us have started the march and stopped. We tried a season of reform, and when the pound of relief didn't come instantly, we returned to old ways. But the biblical narrative pushes us into the discipline of consistency. The spiritual life is a series of small fidelities that train the heart for God's timing. We are invited into a trust that God's timing is not our timetable. 6 circuits may pass before the 7th delivers. The tendency to expect instantaneous results is a modern idol. It tempts us to abandon faithful practice for grand promises. Instead, the story models patient endurance and a community's endurance. There are also hard questions embedded here. Why does God act so decisively in one place and not in another? Why do some people seem spared while others suffer? The account directs us to 2 truths. First, God's actions judge systems of oppression that rely on human power. Second, God's mercy remains open to those who turn toward Him, even from unlikely places. Rahab's inclusion shows that redemption is possible. God's patterns of justice and mercy are complex. They resist simplistic answers, but invite trust. We should refuse to answer suffering with trite explanations. Instead, we must persist in faith, seek understanding, and embody compassion. The fall of the walls of Jericho also cautions us about trusting defensive measures that promise safety, but foster spiritual sterility. Walls can create a false security that muffles the call to love the neighbor. They can become a comfortable status quo that blinds communities to injustice. The biblical critique is not necessarily of walls, literally speaking, but of whatever we build to avoid dependence on God and responsibility toward others. When the city of Jericho made its security into an idol, its walls became a sign of a heart that refused to trust God. The collapse of the walls, therefore, was an act that exposed the city's fundamental orientation. How then do we proceed? First, name your walls. Identify the habitual patterns, fears, and stabilizing comforts that block the movement of God's grace in your life. Be specific. Is it a relationship you protect by silence? Is it a business ethic that edges into exploitation? Is it an inner narrative, I must keep control, that breeds anxiety and isolation? Naming is not a shaming act, but an honest assessment. Second, commit to small acts of obedience. The march was not one dramatic moment. It was an endurance of smaller acts. Perhaps for you it is regular confession to a trusted friend, weekly steps toward reconciliation, or a consistent practice of generosity. Third, engage community. The story insists on corporate action. Invite others into the process. Find a church, a small group, or a trusted circle that will walk with you. Fourth, hold fast to hope while refusing cheap theology. We do not promise instant fixes. We do promise that God is at work, and that obedience opens space for divine intervention. There will be days when it seems nothing has changed. There will be nights when silence feels deafening. On those days, remember the cadence of the march. 1, 2, 3, day after day, until the 7th pulls everything into a new register. Our spiritual life is punctuated by such rhythms, seasons of labor, seasons of waiting, and seasons of explosive change that reshapes the landscape. God often honors perseverance in ways that surprise us, not because we mastered the method, but because we refused to be satisfied with half measures and kept walking in trust. Let us consider Rahab again, not to sentimentalize her story, but to learn from its depth. She was marginalized, and yet she exercised a decisive faith. She recognized God's movement and aligned herself with it. Her scarlet cord is both symbol and strategy, symbol of her faith that secured protection, strategy in that she made a visible sign to the invaders. God's mercy was not arbitrary. It required Rahab's response. Her story points us to a posture that combines faith and action. Mercy reaches out. Faith reaches in. Redemption often involves both. At the same time, we must be careful not to turn the story into a spiritual one-size-fits-all. Not every wall falls the same way. Not every struggle ends with an unmistakable collapse. Suffering, loss, and unanswered questions persist. Yet we can trust that the God who brought down Jericho's walls is attentive to the walls of our lives. We are invited to participate, to march, to blow the trumpet of testimony, to join the communal shout that testifies to the presence of God among us. There is also a call to humility here. The victory at Jericho was not a moment for Israel's self-satisfaction. The narrative makes clear that the triumph belonged to God, who overthrew human pride. Our tendency is to claim credit, to fashion our victories into monuments to our own skill. The biblical witness cautions us, when walls fall, attribute the deliverance to the one whose presence was carried in the ark. Give God the glory. Let gratitude and reverent humility supplant boastful pride. What might a practical season of marching look like for you? Consider a plan that resembles Israel's discipline. First, form a daily commitment that is simple and sustainable. A brief time of prayer, an act of kindness, or a sacrifice of convenience. Second, repeat that commitment consistently for a season, 6 weeks for example, and watch how small habits sculpt the heart. Third, on a significant day, a day you mark as a Sabbath of breakthrough perhaps, bring that discipline before God in community. Invite others to witness your step of obedience. The discipline is not magic, it is formation. Yet such patterns create readiness for God's disruptive action. Community is crucial in this process. A solitary march is vulnerable to distraction. When we decide together, we reinforce faith. The corporate shout that brought down Jericho's walls reminds us that the spiritual life is inherently social. It is about mutual encouragement, correction, and worship. When a church repents together, when a family binds itself to mercy, when a small group persists in prayer for one another, those unified actions shape the environment for God to act. There are also pastoral cautions in this story. We must not equate obedience with preferential treatment. The biblical narrative holds tension between divine justice and mercy. Some suffered, some were spared. Rahab's example shows that mercy can pierce judgment, but it does not suggest a formulaic outcome for every person. We need pastoral sensitivity when life does not deliver the answers we seek. We must comfort, not condemn. We must bear one another's burdens, even when a wall does not immediately fall. As we move toward a close, let us hear the crux of the message. The fall of the walls of Jericho models how God can bring down what we incorrectly depend on, and how God can rescue the faithful even within the circles of judgment. The narrative calls us to examine what false securities we've constructed, to adopt a rhythm of faithful obedience, to participate in communal worship and service, and to trust God's timing. The walls that fence in our fears and prevent our loving need to be confronted not with more clever tactics, but with persistent communal obedience to God. So what is your Jericho? Take a moment, and not casually, to name one wall in your life. Is it the wall of pride that keeps you from humility? The wall of habit that chains you to old patterns? The wall of fear that prevents you from stepping into vocation or reconciliation? Tell someone. Place this struggle into a trusting relationship and commit to one small, repeatable step of obedience this week. Invite a friend or a small group to hold you accountable. If you're part of a church community, consider creating a season of corporate prayer and focused obedience together. The story did not unfold in isolation. It was the work of a people. We conclude with a brief blessing and an invitation. May the God who ordered the procession at Jericho grant you the courage to name your walls, the discipline to keep walking when nothing changes, and the grace to receive mercy even in unexpected places. May we, as a community, find the strength to march together, to sound the call of testimony, and to shout with one voice when God invites us into breakthrough. Share this with someone who needs to hear that God still brings down walls. Leave a comment naming one wall you are willing to begin marching against, one concrete step you will take this week, and let us walk with you. May peace and steady faith be with you until the day the walls fall. Amen.